In the last video, we looked at the 144,000 who were the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and we looked at the three angels who proclaimed the message of the gospel, warn about mystery Babylon, and warn about the mark of the beast. And now we will look at the two great harvests at the end of history, the general wheat harvest and the grape harvest. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over the fire. And he called with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, Put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe. So the angel swung his sickle over the earth and gathered the grape harvest of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle, for 1,600 stadia. The first thing that we want to do in this scene is count the number of figures. We have three angels on the earth, we have the Son of Man, and we have three angels in heaven. Oftentimes in the Bible, and especially in the book of Revelation, 7 is a number of completion. 7 is the number of heaven and earth united under the reign of God. And so the appearance of 7 here is certainly not an accident. However, there seems to be more going on here than just that. The three angels who announce to men on the earth clearly represent the church, because they say the things that Christians are summoned to say. They proclaim the gospel, they warn Babylon the Great, and they warn people not to take the mark of the beast. Now, the three other angels in heaven are clearly heavenly beings. They are our counterpart, just as we are a sort of angelic priesthood upon the earth, so they are an angelic priesthood in heaven. But in the middle of these six angels, you have the Son of Man sitting on a cloud being the typical point of interface between the heavenly and earthly realms. So thus again, we have the cosmic Christ who connects the church, that is, the first three angels with heaven, the last three angels. And this has the effect of affirming our heavenly identity, because we are in Christ who connects heaven and earth, as it says in Colossians, that all things in heaven and earth have been reconciled, that is, they have been brought together in the person of Jesus. This is Revelation's way of saying this same thing. Now, notice also that this places an accent upon Christ. It shows that he is the point of everything. He takes the point of emphasis in the center. There is a parallel here. You have three angels mentioned before him, and you have three angels mentioned after him. And so these types of chiasms occur oftentimes in the Bible, and they emphasize whatever is in the middle. And so it's no surprise to us that Jesus would receive this emphasis, that he would be in the center position. Structuring device does more than that, though. It seems to be helpful in interpreting what is going to take place in this chapter. Remember that we have two harvests coming up, the harvest of the wheat and the harvest of the grapes. Now, these angels, each one of them seems to have a partner, all right, that shares with it in a common theme. The first angel comes out with the gospel. This is a message of salvation. He lines up with the angel in heaven who signals the time of the wheat harvest. Now, the wheat harvest is the ingathering of the righteous, so you can tell that both of these angels share in a common theme. Now, the other angels share in a negative theme. The angel who condemns Babylon lines up with the angel who has the sickle for the grape harvest, who will cast the grapes into the winepress of God's wrath. And the angel who warns about the mark of the beast and hellfire lines up with the angel from the altar who signals when it's time for the grape harvest, when it's time to judge the wicked. So each angel shares with its partner angel in either a positive or a negative theme. Now, the reason this matters is because some people do not interpret this chapter this way. Some think that the harvest of the wheat is not the ingathering of the righteous, but it's the destruction of the wicked. And then the uh, the sickle that reaps the grapes, that scene is also the destruction of the wicked. So they think that these two harvests, neither one of them refers to ingathering of the righteous. They both refer to the destruction of the wicked, just looked at from two different angles. I mean, there are other places in Revelation where you'll get two visions back to back that uh, the second vision, it just reinterprets the first vision. It just looks at the first vision from a different angle. There are some who think that is taking place here, and I'll give you some reasons here shortly why they believe that. Now, I am in disagreement with them for a number of reasons that I will describe. I think, as many scholars think, that the wheat harvest is positive, that it's about the righteous, and the grape harvest is negative. It's about the destruction of the wicked. But the first reason for believing that is to notice this structure, that the wheat harvest lines up with another positive angel, the angel with the gospel of salvation. And therefore, this is our first piece of evidence to suggest that the wheat harvest is positive, that it is the ingathering of the righteous into God's barn, as it were, while the grape harvest is the destruction of the wicked. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, Put in your sickle, and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. The grain harvest poses many interpretive challenges. The first of it, which is, why does this angel tell Jesus what to do? You would expect something different. You would expect on Judgment Day that Jesus is telling the angels when it's time to reap. You wouldn't expect Jesus to be sitting on a cloud and then an angel tells him when it's time to go. What is up with that? And is this a problem? Why has the hierarchy of heaven seemingly been inverted here? Well, some folks will say that you're looking at it too closely, that this is just apocalyptic license. Angels oftentimes are the directors who run the show. I mean, they reveal many things to John. They speak in several different places. They're the ones who blow the seven trumpets. They're the ones who pour out the seven bowls. They're involved in the harvest here, and they're kind of the glue that holds one scene to another. They often introduce a scene, they often conclude a scene. And since they are kind of, just the constant presence of apocalyptic, the constant presence in the book of Revelation, you're not supposed to look at this too closely and go, oh, look at this, an angel just told Jesus what to do. Well, that really offends me. Now, some folks will say that this is the answer, that it's just, this is the license that you have in writing apocalyptic. Ultimately, I do not think that this is a very good explanation, though there are some smart people who go with it. I think the next answer is much better. The angel emerges from the temple where God is. He is simply relaying the Father's message to the Son. Now, this is interesting because this ends up being an apocalyptic and a symbolic version of what Jesus already taught in the Gospels. In Mark 13:32, Jesus is talking about the last day, and he says, But concerning that day or that hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Now, the reason the angel came out of the temple is because he didn't know when it was time to harvest. God had to tell him. Remember, the temple is where God is. So God has told the angel, because the angels in heaven don't know when it's time to reap. And then after the message is received from God by the angel comes out and tells the Son, because the Son doesn't know when it's time to harvest either. And so this scene just ends up becoming an apocalyptic version of what Jesus already taught. He told us the angels and the Son do not know. Well, in this scene, the message comes from the temple. This informs the angel who informs the Son because they were not aware prior to the Father divulging that information. There is another interpretive issue here. After the Son of Man is mentioned, there is another angel in verse 15. Now, does this imply that Jesus is the angel of the Lord? If I were to say a guy walked into the room, and then I were to say another guy walked into the room, well, why does it make sense to say another guy walked into the room? Well, it's because he's not the first one. There was a guy who walked into the room prior to him. Now, we have that same sort of situation here. The text discusses Jesus as the Son of Man, and then right after that, it says another angel in reference to a heavenly being. So, does that imply that the first angel is Jesus, and then the angel who comes out of the temple is another angel? Some folks will suggest that this means that Jesus is the angel of the Lord. In the Old Testament, you oftentimes have an angel show up who is, the writer describes him as an angel. And then he talks like he himself is Yahweh. He talks as though he is God himself. And this is the angel of the Lord. And Christians throughout the ages have interpreted this to be a reference to the pre-incarnate Christ, that before Christ was ever born in Bethlehem, whenever he shows up in the Old Testament, he shows up as the angel of the Lord. And some folks will look at this passage here in Revelation 14, and they will see this as affirming that way of interpreting the angel of the Lord. However, this practice of introducing an angel by saying another angel is something that takes place throughout the book of Revelation, and especially in this section. And this is important because the angel at the beginning of these six angels, the first one in Revelation 14:6, he is introduced as being another angel. Well, does that mean that an angel is mentioned right before him? No. You actually have to go all the way back to Revelation 12. You have to go back 2 chapters to find an angel where you have Michael and his angels fighting against the devil and his angels in chapter 12. And so when you get to the first angel in Revelation 14 and it says another angel, the idea isn't that, well, whatever figure was immediately mentioned prior to this angel is also an angel. No, it just means this is another angel that if you go back far enough in the book, you will find that other angels have already been mentioned, and now we're going to talk about a different angel. Now we're going to talk about another angel. And so when an angel is discussed right after Christ, and that angel is called another angel, that doesn't imply that whatever came immediately prior, that is Jesus, is an angel. That just means that if you go back far enough, you will find that there are other angels, and now we've arrived at another one. And so I think that if you just follow this phrase throughout the book, you will see that it doesn't necessarily suggest that Jesus here is an angel. It just means that there have been other angels mentioned, and now we have another angel being mentioned. So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Now we come to the question that I mentioned a moment ago. Is the wheat harvest positive or negative? I suggest, as many others have suggested, such as Richard Bauckham, that the wheat harvest is positive, that this is bringing in the righteous, and the grape harvest is negative. It's the destruction of the wicked. Though others will say this is the destruction of the wicked viewed from 2 different angles. Now, why do they believe that? Well, the reason is because the language in this section comes from the book of Joel. Joel has 2 harvests also that he mentions back to back, the harvest of the wheat and the harvest of the grapes. And in Joel, both of those are negative. Both of them are about the destruction of the wicked. The context here in Joel is God sitting in judgment upon the nations. The first harvest, it says, put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. And then after that, it immediately moves on to the grapes. And it says, come, tread, for the winepress is full. The vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Multitudes, multitudes, in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. So here, this is totally negative. I mean, you go and read Joel 3 in context, it's undeniable that the harvest and the grapes in the winepress, that they're both totally negative, and there are many verbal parallels between Revelation 14 and this passage in Joel 3, and so we know that Joel is standing behind our text here in Revelation. And so for many folks it's simple. Well, if it's negative in Joel, and Revelation is using Joel, then in Revelation it must be negative as well. However, there are many reasons to think that John has taken Joel and recontextualized it for his own purposes, that Joel does not put him on a leash by any stretch, because we've already seen that the 144,000 were introduced as the first fruits of the grain harvest. We discussed this in the last video, that the grain harvest took place in two stages. First, you harvested a small amount of grain, and you took it to the temple and presented it to the Lord. It's the first fruits. And the first fruits has the effect of sanctifying the rest of the harvest. Right? So you introduce the first fruits to the Lord. This sanctifies the rest of the harvest. And then you go and you harvest the general harvest. Well, that is what's taking place here in Revelation 14. At the beginning of the chapter, we had the 144,000 as the first fruits. And now we have the general harvest. Well, the 144,000 were the martyrs of Christ. That is positive. They were being harvested because they are part of the righteous. Now, if the first fruits of the grain was the righteous, was the 144,000, now that we're at the general harvest, you would expect the general harvest to be the righteous as well. This is the rest of the church. And this makes sense because in Revelation 20, the martyrs of Christ are resurrected first, and then the rest of the church is resurrected later, right? The martyrs come first. And so here we are, the 144,000 martyrs, they are the first fruits, and then the rest of the grain harvest that comes later, this is the rest of the church. So it just makes a lot of sense then, in context, to take the grain harvest as being positive overall, both the first fruits and the general harvest of the grain. Now, Bauckham reminds us that, yes, wheat can have a picture of judgment associated with it, but this is always involved in winnowing or threshing. Right? So when you thresh the wheat is when you stomp upon it because you want to break loose any of the chaff, right? And then after you stomp upon it, you take it and you throw it up in the air. You take your pitchfork or whatever and you toss the wheat up in the air so that the wind will catch the chaff that you've broken loose by stomping on it, and the wind will drive that chaff away. Now, there are many places in the Bible where harvesting the wheat is associated with judgment. It is a negative image, but it's not the wheat itself, right? The wheat itself is good. The harvest of the wheat itself is good. The judgment image takes place whenever you have threshing or winnowing of the wheat, whenever you stomp on it to break loose the chaff, or whenever you throw it up into the wind so that the wind will drive away the chaff. That is a judgment picture. And you'll notice here in this wheat harvest, there is no threshing and there is no winnowing. There's neither one of these negative images because this is not a negative judgment. This is positive. This is gathering in the righteous. And so we want to take a moment just to look at a few examples of this. Jeremiah chapter 51. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, the daughter of Babylon is like a threshing floor at the time when it is trodden. Yet a little while, and the time of her harvest will come. Well, this is a grain harvest, and it's negative. But you'll notice, as Bauckham points out, it includes the idea of threshing, of stomping upon the grain. Luke chapter 3. His winnowing fork is in his hand to clear his threshing floor and to gather the wheat into his barn, but the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. Well, you'll notice that there is a negative picture of judgment here. But however, it's not the wheat itself, it's the chaff. The winnowing fork, you use this to separate the chaff, and then the chaff gets burned up, but the wheat gets gathered into the barn because the wheat harvest itself is positive. It's a picture of salvation, of the righteous being taken in to the domain of God. Matthew 13:30, let both, that is the wheat and the weeds. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. So, the harvest of the wheat itself is not negative. Only getting rid of the chaff and the weeds around the wheat, that is negative. And since there is no chaff and there are no weeds mentioned here in Revelation, since it's only the wheat harvest that's mentioned, this should be understood to be a positive image as it oftentimes is in other places. This is the ingathering of the righteous, while the grapes represent the destruction of the wicked. Additionally, a positive harvest should be expected following the angel who proclaimed the gospel. Remember, this chapter begins with an angel who proclaims the gospel of salvation. Now, the last time this took place, back in chapter 11, it was a big deal. The nations repented. Uh, if you haven't seen that, I recommend you go back and watch that video. The nations repented the last time we had a vision of the gospel's proclamation, because Revelation wants to show us that our witness is effective, that the gospel is powerful, that it will bring people to repentance, it will bring them to salvation. So now the gospel has been proclaimed in this chapter. So you should expect a positive harvest. You should expect another reminder that the message has been effective, and that there will be some who are saved, that there will be a lot of people who are saved. Remind ourselves again that the positive angel lines up with the wheat harvest in the six angel structuring device. Each angel shared in the theme of its partnering angel, and the wheat harvest angel lines up with that angel who proclaimed the gospel. And then finally, the winepress corresponds to the wine of God's wrath and Babylon's wine of fornication mentioned earlier in this chapter, just as the grain harvest lined up with the first fruits, which were the 144,000. So even though Joel has both of these harvests as negative, Revelation has definitely taken this and done something else. I mean, oftentimes these Old Testament allusions in Revelation, they are helpful in interpreting. There's no doubt about that. But they do not absolutely restrict the book of Revelation. Revelation takes a lot of freedom in the way it incorporates these Old Testament passages and reappropriates them for its own purposes. I think that is what has taken place here. Yes, Joel is behind this passage, but that doesn't determine everything. There are lots of things going on in the context, and we need to pay attention to Revelation's own context if we want to interpret this passage correctly. And another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has the authority over the fire. And he called with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, "Put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grape harvest of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. This comes from a passage in Isaiah 63. Where Yahweh is a divine warrior who is treading upon his enemies. Who is this who comes from Edom with garments of glowing colors from Bozrah? This one who is majestic in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength. He answers, "It is I who speak in righteousness, mighty to save." Then the interlocutor continues, "Why is your apparel red, and your garments like the one who treads in the winepress?" Yahweh answers, "I have trodden the wine trough alone, and from the nations there was no man with me. I also trod them in my anger, and trampled them in my wrath, and their lifeblood is sprinkled on my garments, and I stained all my clothing. For the day of vengeance was in my heart, and my year of redemption has come." This is an important passage because it's clearly being alluded to here. And it shows us that when Yahweh tramples in the winepress, he gets the blood of his enemies on his garments. Well, later on, when we get to Revelation 19, Jesus is going to show up with the heavenly army, and he's going to have blood on his garments. Right? It's clearly a reference to this scene here that is shared between Isaiah 63 and Revelation 14, where Yahweh gets the blood of his enemies on his clothes. But you will find that when Jesus shows up, and it says that he has blood upon his garments, there are many interpreters including good interpreters, who balk at this image and they're bothered by this. It seems morbid to him that Jesus would be covered with the blood of his enemies. And so they say, well, this is not the blood of his enemies. This is Jesus' own blood from his crucifixion. He isn't covered in the blood of his enemies. This blood that he's covered with represents the love he has for us and the suffering he endured on our behalf. He's covered in his own blood. And, I do accept and do believe that the cross and the sacrifice of Jesus is at the heart of everything in the book of Revelation. But you don't use that to water down the judgment pictures in the book of Revelation. Right? When you have Isaiah 63 trotting down the grapes, represents Yahweh being covered in the blood of his enemies. When you see that that is being incorporated into Revelation 14, and then a few chapters after that, Jesus is covered in blood, you connect the dots, right? It's the blood of his enemies. It's not his own blood. I have no problem at all with passages in Revelation that talk about the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. No problem at all. I do have a problem with people trying to soften the book by using the cross. No, Jesus is covered in the blood of his enemies. This is a book of judgment for those who have persecuted and murdered the church. And I think we do a great disservice to the book by trying to dilute those images. And we do a great disservice to the martyrs of Christ. The blood of the saints is precious in God's sight, and that's why we get these magnificent pictures of judgment. And you really steal something away from that when you try to get around that and you try to say, no, it's not the blood of his enemies. This is the blood of the crucifixion. That is a very sentimental way to dilute the book. And so I'm not in favor of that interpretation. So we're talking about the winepress of the wrath of God. What is the imagery here? What does this look like? Well, Logos put out a great illustration of what this would look like. You would have an elevated platform here. I hope you can see my laser pointer. You have an elevated platform, and you have one or two guys who would get in here, and they would stomp upon the grapes to release the juice. Well, then the juice would come down to this channel, and here you have a filter, which is, as it says, is thorns or other plant fibers that are used here to filter the grape juice. And the grape juice would flow down, and it would enter the first vat. And after this first vat is filled up, you could plug it up with a rock, and then it would flow down into a second vat, right? And then after you filled up the vats, you let it sit for a few days. It would bubble, suggesting the fermentation process. And when the bubbling stopped, the juice was now wine, and you could take it and put it in jars. Here is I'm going to give you some pictures of some real ones that archaeologists have discovered. Here's one in the land of Israel, and you would get up here on this elevated platform, and you would stomp upon the grapes, and then it would flow down, and it would begin to fill up these vats down below. Here's one that is either very rudimentary or it just hasn't been excavated all that much, but as it says here, there's a carved depression for grapes and crushing, and then the juice would flow down into here. Here's another example, and you can tell that the platform for stomping would either be up here. I think it would be up here, but either way, you can tell it comes down here, and there's a flow that goes down into this deep vat. I can't tell how this vat here gets filled. I'm guessing that outside of the camera frame over here is another stomping platform, and that it would fill up this vat, and then maybe the overflow would also dump into the steeper vat. You can't really tell, but you get the basic sense that the flow goes from one vat into another. Again, it looks like here you have two platforms right next to each other that you would stomp upon grapes here, and it would come down into these vats back here. And then over here toward the front of the screen, you would have another platform for stomping grapes, and it would come down, and it would fill up this vat and this vat. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. It states specifically that they were trodden down outside the city. Now, why is this particular language being used? Well, it's likely this eye for an eye principle that pervades the book of Revelation. Back in Revelation 11:2, the church's persecutors were described as those who trod down the holy city. And now they are described as those being trodden down in the winepress of God's wrath outside the city. And so we see, in many different places in Revelation 21, 22, that the city of God represents his people. Well, back in chapter 11, we saw the people of God represented as a city in the world that is vulnerable, where it is physically vulnerable to the violence of its enemies, and the nations are able to stomp upon it. Well, now that's changing. Those who stomp upon the city have been taken outside the city, and they're being trodden down. Ultimately, I think this is the best explanation for this language. However, there are other explanations, and I don't think that they are mutually exclusive. Another explanation is that those who were under the curse of the law were often killed outside the Israelite encampment or outside the city. And this is, we see a good example of this in Numbers chapter 15, which says, "And the Lord said to Moses, the man shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. And all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, as the Lord commanded Moses." So this guy is guilty of violating the Sabbath. The Sabbath was the covenant that represented all the other covenants that Yahweh had made with his people. So to dishonor the Sabbath was a really big deal. This is a way of saying, I'm going to dishonor all the covenants of God. In this sense, the Sabbath is sort of like a wedding ring. If you take off the wedding ring and throw it at your spouse, you are symbolically rejecting the entire marriage covenant. Well, this is kind of what you do when you dishonor the Sabbath. So that's a really big deal in the Old Testament. And so this guy is taken and killed outside the camp, illustrating this same principle. And this may be the operative principle here in Revelation 14 as well. Another but similar idea. Christ was put to death by his enemies outside the city, so now he puts his enemies to death outside the city. The fact that Christ was crucified outside the city of Jerusalem was interpreted by the early Christians. You get an example of this in Hebrews 13. In verse 11, it says, "For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as an offering for sin are burned outside the camp." Now, what the writer is going to do is compare the sin offering to Jesus. He's the ultimate sin offering. And so, since you had to deal with the sin offering outside the camp, so Jesus necessarily dies outside the city. In verse 12, he says, "Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people through his own blood, suffered outside the gate. So let us go out to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach." So these ideas, they're not mutually exclusive. I would just tell you, within the context of Revelation, the connection to chapter 11 makes the most sense to me. The earth dwellers were trotting upon the holy city. Now they are taken outside the city, and they are trod upon. This sort of eye for an eye principle is oftentimes the governing principle for how justice works in the book of Revelation. Shifting gears, the angel who signals that it's time for the grape harvest, it says that he has power over fire, right? And he is in heaven, and he has power over fire. Now, Jewish tradition often talked of angels whom God had placed in charge of the elements like wind, water, earth, and fire. The Testament of Abraham names Peruel as the archangel over fire, and his name contains a reference to the Greek word pyros, which is the word that means fire. And so some folks go there. They think that this is an angel who has control over the element of fire in creation in general. Now, I don't think that's probably the best option on this. I think this is a reference to the angel back in chapter 8 who offered up the prayers of God's people at the incense. I mean, he used fire to light the incense, to mix it with the prayers of the saints, and to offer it up to God. And then, because the saints were crying out for vengeance, he then takes fire from the altar and throws it upon the earth. And this is one of the scenes of Judgment Day in the text. I think that's what this is referring to. I think the reason this passage is looking back to the angel who offers up the prayers of the saints is because the text is reminding us, why is God doing this? Why is this horrible judgment taking place? Well, it's because of what they did to his people. It's because of the way that they have harmed and killed the saints. It says the blood went out for 1,600 stadia. A stadion is about 607 feet, or 185 meters. So 1,600 stadia altogether would be about 184 miles of blood. So this is a very long, bloody river. Of course, the number here is important, right? This represents a universal winepress, a winepress of judgment that is being trodden down all over the world. And we know this because of the way that the numbers work. 4 has been the number of universality. It's been the number of creation, all creation. You get several references, the heaven, the earth, the sea, and everything under the earth. You get peoples, tribes, nations, and tongues. Whenever the Bible wants to use universal language for creation, it uses the number 4. And so 4 is the number of creation times the number of creation times 100 to get 1,600. And remember, we got 144,000 the same way, right? We took 12, the number of God's people, times 12, the number of God's people, and then we multiplied it by 1,000 in order to get 144,000. Well, that's what we're doing here. We took the number of creation times the number of creation, and then we multiplied it by 100 just to magnify the number. So this is universal judgment. This is a universal winepress where God has taken all of the evil elements of creation and he's trotting them down all over the world. This gives us another square to add to our numerical story of Revelation. I've taken our two rectangular numbers, 1,260 days and 42 months, and I have combined them into a single shape. And of course, rectangular numbers are both evil and good. And triangular numbers are evil. We have seen a number of triangular numbers up to this point, and now we finally have our second square. Our first one was the 144,000 martyrs, and now our second one is 1,600 stadia, creation purged of evil and God's winepress. To give this scene a square number makes sense because obviously it's a very good thing to purge God's creation of evil. From its northernmost point at Tyre and its southernmost point at the Egyptian border, Israel stretches about 1,664 stadia. So that's only 64 stadia away from our number here in Revelation, causing many interpreters to think the land of Israel is in mind here. And I am in agreement with this. But this raises the question, if the math points to a universal winepress of judgment, the number of creation times the number of creation, then how can it also be the land of Israel? How can it be both universal and local at the same time? Well, the reason is because the land of Israel in Second Temple Judaism was understood to be a picture of the global inheritance, that ultimately the promised land given to Abraham is not just a strip of ground in the Middle East, but the promised land is the whole world. And the land of Israel was just a picture of the coming global inheritance, or rather the land of Israel was just the beginning, and it was to be expanded and stretched until it covered the whole world. And we're going to cover this in more detail when we get to Revelation 21, but I just want to show you a couple of texts right now. Now, in Isaiah 53, the Messiah has died, and this has some results, one of which is the expansion of the promised land to cover the whole world in Isaiah 54. Now look at this passage here, where Israel is being expanded to cover the world. Enlarge the place of your tent, stretch out the curtains of your dwellings, spare not. Lengthen your cords and strengthen your pegs, for you will spread abroad to the right and to the left, and your descendants will possess nations and will resettle the desolate cities. So here the Messiah has died, and sort of the knee-jerk reaction of the next chapter is to expand the promised land, to possess nations. I mean, this is much different than what you find in Deuteronomy chapter 4, where the land of Israel is greatly restricted. Very precise boundaries are established in the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy, for what the land of Israel would be. But the Messiah dies in Isaiah 53, and now that changes. Now the boundaries expand to overtake all of creation. The Jewish people understood that the land of Israel would ultimately become the entire world, as we can tell in some of their most popular writings. In Jubilees, it says, "Kings will come from you, Jacob, and they will rule everywhere that the tracks of mankind have been trod." That is, not just in the land of Israel, they will rule everywhere. "And I shall give to your seed all of the land under heaven, and they will rule in all nations as they have desired. And after this, all of the earth will be gathered together, and they will inherit it forever." So passages like Isaiah 54 did not slip under the radar. Right? Ancient Jews knew that it wasn't just going to be the land of Israel, it was the whole world. Fourth Ezra, another first century Jewish apocalypse that's similar to Revelation, teaches the same thing. "But we, your people, whom you have called your firstborn, only begotten, zealous for you, and most dear, have been given into their hands," that is, into the hands of their enemies. "If the world has indeed been created for us, why do we not possess our world as an inheritance? How long will this be so?" So the fourth Ezra writer thinks, he just assumes, he knows that ultimately it's not the land of Israel, that it's the entire world is the promised land. And so it seems preposterous to him that he has been given over into the hands of his enemies. Now, like I said, we will look at these texts and other ones, including passages in Paul, where the Apostle Paul teaches the same thing. We will look at this in more detail in Revelation 21. I just want to look at it here because we can see that the math suggests that this is a universal battle. But then it's also the land of Israel, and you say, well, how can that be a universal battle? Well, in Second Temple Jewish thought, the land of Israel was actually the whole world, that the local Israel was just a picture of the global inheritance to come. So there is no contradiction here when you take the number of all creation and you also take the land of Israel as a picture of a global battle. Both of these images make sense within the Jewish milieu and within the context of Second Temple Jewish theology. It says, "Blood came up to the horses' bridles." Now, this seems to be a very common hyperbole in the ancient world, right? I'll give you a couple of examples from ancient Jewish texts. In the book of Enoch, it says, "And the horse will walk up to its chest in the blood of sinners." In fourth Ezra, again, first century Jewish apocalypse, "And there shall be blood from the sword as high as a horse's belly, and a man's thigh, and a camel's hock." And so this way of talking about blood, when you want to use a hyperbole, that is a figure of speech, where you overstate something for the sake of effect, when you want to talk about a bloody battle, this is a common image in the ancient world. Now, the reason this is worth pointing out is because there are many people who don't read the Revelation this way. They think that the book is to be read in the most literal sense possible. And so what they do is they go over into the land of Israel, into Jezreel Valley, and they look for a spot where, the topography, where the landscape sort of dips down, and they go, oh, this is a place where if you killed lots of people and lots of horses, the blood could come up to a horse's bridles. And they're out trying to find a literal spot where this could take place. What they don't seem to know is that, it's not just these two examples. There are loads and loads of examples. In Richard Bauckham's book, The Climax of Prophecy, he gives you pages of examples of ancient writers using this figure of speech, of blood coming up to a horse's bridles. And so you don't need to go out and try to find a literal spot in Israel's landscape where this can happen. right? This is a common figure of speech in the ancient world. The book of Revelation is written in the first century using first century language, and we have to read it in an ancient way. Now, even though Bauckham accepts that this is a figure of speech, he does think it's significant that it's in the plural. All right. Many English translations, including the one that I used earlier, say it comes up to a horse's bridle, singular. The New Revised Standard Version, as Bauckham points out, also gets it wrong when it says as high as a horse's bridle. But in the Greek, it actually says as high as the horses' bridles, suggesting that there are many horses. Now, Bauckham takes this as a reference to chapter 19, where Christ appears with the heavenly army. Now, the reason why that may be significant is because in the battle in chapter 19, there's always this argument. Does Christ alone fight the battle, or do his saints fight with him? Are they just there, or do they participate in the battle? Now, Bauckham says that the saints will participate because here the blood came up as high as the horses' bridles, suggesting that the army on the horses are out and engaged in the battle, and the blood is all around them. So it's an interesting thought. I thought I would bring that to your attention. Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and amazing, 7 angels with 7 plagues, which are the last, for with them the wrath of God is finished. And I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass mingled with fire, and also those who had conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name, standing beside the sea of glass with harps of God in their hands. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and amazing are your deeds, O Lord God the Almighty. Just and true are your ways, O King of the nations. Who will not fear, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. Now, this mini episode is an interlocking device. It's one of our transitional episodes that binds 2 sections together. The 7 visions of holy war are coming to an end, and the 7 bowls of wrath are about to begin. And so this interlocking device is going to connect these 2 episodes. And we have seen how this book works. It builds up to the second coming of Christ several times. The 7 seals build up to the second coming of Christ. And then after you get to the second coming, we go back and in the 7 trumpets look at history leading up to the last battle in a different perspective. The 7 trumpets end with the second coming of Christ. And then we went on to the 7 visions of holy war. We just got to the great harvest at the end of history, which of course involves the second coming of Christ. And so now we need to back up again and look at history from another perspective, from the perspective of the bowls of wrath, which will also culminate in the second coming of Christ. Now, since we are transitioning, we have this interlocking device. The visions of holy war was unique in its use of the language of signs. I saw a great sign in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun. I saw another great sign in heaven, a red fiery dragon, etc. And you had the woman who went into the wilderness for 42 months, just as the children of Israel, according to Numbers chapter 35, when they were in the wilderness, they had 42 stops. Right? They had 42 different named places where they stopped in their journey to the promised land. And now we're coming to the bowls of wrath, which are going to be the plagues of Egypt, which are dumped out on the whole world system. So right here in the middle, we get this interlocking device that has, it incorporates the themes of both of these episodes. It has the language of great and wondrous signs, and it also has references to the plagues of Egypt and to the Exodus. And so this is a good transitional episode, which incorporates the themes of these 2 much larger episodes that it wants to bind together. The Song of Moses and the Lamb. Now the 144,000 martyrs who are playing harps in 14:2 are joined by the rest of the church because the general harvest of the wheat is complete. Remember that back in at the beginning of chapter 14, we had the 144,000 as the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and they were playing their harps before the Lord. And then later on, the general wheat harvest happened, which was the rest of the church. And now they are playing their harps before the Lord. Right? So there's a logical progression here. This all makes sense, and it reinforces the notion that both the first fruits and the general wheat harvest were positive. That both of those were harvests of salvation, not harvests of judgment. Now, it could be translated that they were standing by the sea, or it could be translated that they were standing upon the sea. Which one should you go with? The parallel with the children of Israel standing next to the Red Sea, singing in Exodus 15, is likely going to be the deciding factor. So, in Exodus 14, Pharaoh and his army are overthrown, and then in Exodus 15, the children of Israel sing next to the Red Sea. Well, here, the beast, the new Pharaoh, has been overthrown. And so now it is likely that they are standing next to the sea, singing singing the Song of Moses. And so it could go either way, but to maintain the parallel with Exodus 15, I'm going to say that they were standing next to the sea. You know, the image could certainly be trumped up by having them standing upon the sea. That is possible. The Greek will do that, and so it's open. It could go either way. Kraft sees this as a baptismal hymn focused on the fact that both Moses and the Lamb have led their people through water to a new life. Elsewhere in the New Testament, crossing the Red Sea and baptism as a Christian are compared. I mean, it's debatable in Romans chapter 6. I think that Paul's discussion on baptism there is being compared to the Red Sea crossing, but it's undeniable in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. He talks about baptism under Moses in the sea and under the cloud, and he compares this to our baptism as Christians. And so Revelation is full of liturgical references. It's full of references to worship scenes the early church would have been familiar with. So this may very well be a baptismal hymn. Joshua and Jesus are both Jesus, right? In Old Testament Hebrew, Joshua's name is Yehoshua. Well, this name after the exile shortens to Yeshua, and that's Jesus' name in Hebrew. And so they actually have the same name. It just sounds a little bit different because one is before the exile, one is after the exile. Hebrew, like other languages, changes over time. So you got Yehoshua before the exile, and then it's just Yeshua after the exile. You lose the H sound. And so they have the same name, but it sounds a little different because it's from two different periods. However, in Greek, and remember that most of the ancient Christians would be reading the Old Testament in Greek, not in Hebrew. Joshua, who led the people into the promised land, his name was Jesus. And Jesus, in the New Testament, his name is Jesus. So it's very easy to compare these two biblical figures for the ancient church since they have the same name in Greek, and Greek was the most common language of the early church. Now, the Song of Moses is interesting in Deuteronomy because it says, "So Moses wrote this song the same day and taught it to the sons of Israel. Then he commissioned Joshua, Jesus, the son of Nun." So Joshua is taking over from Moses, and he is mentioned specifically in the context of the Song of Moses. So now when we have in Revelation the Song of Moses and the Lamb, this may be a reference back to this situation in the book of Deuteronomy, where and the implication is that Jesus is the new Joshua, just as Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land. So now Jesus is going to lead his people into the eternal promised land. The lyrical content of the Song of Moses is much different here in Revelation than the version that you can read back in Deuteronomy 32. This version of the Song of Moses contains allusions to passages all across the Old Testament. And so I just want to briefly survey and summarize the connections between these lyrics and the Old Testament. The verse line, "Great and amazing are your deeds," comes from Psalm 111, which celebrates God's generosity and redemption. O Lord God the Almighty comes from Amos 3, judgments against the idolaters of Samaria. Just and true are your ways. This comes from the actual Song of Moses back in Deuteronomy 32. God is more faithful than man is the point. O King of the nations, who will not fear, O Lord? This comes from Jeremiah 10, where Yahweh triumphs over the false gods. And glorify your name, for you alone are holy. This comes from Psalm 86, where the nations are converted. All nations will come and worship you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. This comes from Psalm 98, and we've seen Psalm 98 alluded to at the beginning of chapter 14, where the angel comes and he proclaims the gospel. And what he basically proclaims is Psalm 98, because Psalm 98 is such a good summary of the primary motifs of the gospel. And so the Song of Moses and the Lamb is, a great summary of the character of God and a great summary of salvation history. All of these things have been taken and brought together under the heading of a single song sang by all of the church, the 144,000 now united with the rest of the righteous. All of God's people have been united to sing this song, which summarizes the character of God and the character of salvation history.